30 Days of Persuasion Plays with me, Paul Macetta. Welcome back. In this episode, we're going to circle back to a classic NLP proposition, one that has dramatically helped me in my life when trying to improve my communication skills. And that is that every behavior has a positive intent. Every behavior has a positive intent. And so what I mean by that is that when people make decisions in their life to behave in a certain way, no matter how crazy, no matter how abnormal, no matter how immoral, no matter how insane you may think those behaviors are, in their mind, that behavior is somehow justified. So for whatever reason, they believe that that particular behavior is serving them positively in some way. Even people that do extremely immoral things, like serial killers, for example, believe it or not, there's some part of their brain that believes that that behavior is somehow going to have a positive impact on their life. Now, does that justify what they do? Does that mean that in a court of law they shouldn't be found guilty? Absolutely not. Does it make them criminally insane? I don't know. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not an attorney, so I don't know what process they go through to determine if somebody is clinically insane. But what I can tell you is that based on my research and my experience, all behaviors have a positive intent. And so another example is if you have a friend that's in a toxic relationship where they're constantly fighting, constantly arguing with their significant other, and they come to you and they tell you about all their problems and they tell you about how turbulent the relationship is and how unhappy they are with this person, and you give them the best advice that you could possibly give them. You spend hours with them on the phone. You tell them, listen, you got to muster up the courage and the braveness to end the relationship. You got to move on. It'll be tough in the beginning, but you got to start a new life, blah, blah, blah. Person gets off the phone with you. What do? They go right back to their significant other. They go right back into the relationship, right back into the toxic behavioral patterns, right? And you look at that person as if they're insane. You cannot understand why that person continues to engage in such negativity. And the reason why is because deep down inside, all people feel that when they behave in a certain way, there's ultimately a positive intent behind that. Because if there wasn't, what would happen is the person would experience something called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is basically what happens when you act or behave in a way that is drastically different from what you truly feel inside. And so what happens is when you start to do that, when you start to act and behave in a way that's very, very far off from the way you really think inside, or the beliefs or the values that you have, you begin to experience this thing called cognitive dissonance, which is an uneasiness that you feel, a sense of imbalance. And you have to try to restore that balance in some way, shape, or form. Human beings love balance. They don't like to feel that cognitive dissonance. So there are many different ways that people will resolve cognitive dissonance. They can either justify their behavior, they can tell you that it doesn't really matter to them, they can write it off as not being important, they can completely change their belief that they originally had to make themselves feel better, or they'll ultimately just stop engaging in the action, right? And so if a person continues to behave in a certain way, even though it may be destructive to their life, in their mind, they believe that it has some sort of a positive intention. So when you converse with people, when you communicate with people that are going through something like that, and you just can't understand why they're doing what they're doing because it makes no logical sense to you, you have to realize that to them, it does make some logical sense in some way, shape, or form. So now the question is, where do you go from here? Now that you know that, how do you use that to better communicate with other people? So today, I got 3 tips for you. Number 1 is not to judge people so easily. Now listen, I covered in an early video that people are extremely judgmental, right? The biggest hoax that we've been told our entire lives is not to judge a book by its cover. Stupid. Doesn't make any logical sense because we're organically wired to judge people by their appearance. We do it subconsciously in the first 5 to 7 seconds of meeting people. So telling people not to do it is like telling people that the sky isn't blue. It's reality. This is the way the human mind works. What master communicators are able to do that average and poor communicators are not able to do is they recognize the fact that they're judging someone, and then they consciously break that pattern and they stop and they go to a place of more complacency or more openness where they're listening to the person and not judging them. So it's not that they're not judging people within the first 5 to 7 seconds of meeting them. Everybody does. It's just that they're aware that they're doing it and then they stop. So that's what you need to do. You need to be aware of the fact that you judge people immediately when you meet them. And of course, you judge people while they're talking to you, because what you're doing is comparing what they're saying and what they're doing versus what you think is right and wrong. You're comparing it and you're leveraging it against your thoughts and beliefs and behaviors. And so ultimately, you come up with a judgment. The judgment could be that the person's wrong, the person's crazy, they're insane, they're stupid, whatever. You have to learn to reserve that judgment, at least temporarily. Second thing you got to do is you got to try to understand their map. So another NLP presupposition, which I talked about in an earlier video, is that the map is not the territory. And so what that means is that this world is the territory. This is reality. This is the world that we live in. But the map that we use, which is in our brain, each one of us has a different map of this world and of this territory. So if you were staring at a GPS system and looking at it, what would it represent? It would represent a certain territory in the world. It would represent a certain landscape. But if you drove to that landscape, it would look drastically different than it does on the GPS system. Well, what each one of us is doing is using our own mental GPS system to make sense of the world. And I got news for you. Everyone's GPS system is different. Now, yes, you do have people whose thoughts and opinions and behaviors on certain things are very similar, so their maps may be very similar, but then you have people whose maps are just drastically different. They just see the world in a different way than you do. So what you got to do is you got to try to understand how they see the world, because if your intention is to really get through to them and effectively communicate to them to the point that you impart your message on them in such a way that maybe it helps them change a destructive behavior, for example, you first have to understand their map. You have to understand the way they see the world. You have to start communicating on their frequency or on their wavelength, because if you don't, you're going to constantly bump heads with that person and they're never going to take you seriously. The next thing is to try to show them a better way based on their map of the world. So when communicating with somebody, you want to try to figure out what emotions drive them and what beliefs drive them. You want to find out what beliefs are important to them, because these are just some of the things that make up that mental map. So in the process of understanding their mental map, you're going to begin to understand what beliefs and what values they have. And then once you do that, you want to try to show them a better way that's conducive to their value system. So for example, going back to the example of the destructive relationship, let's hypothetically say that that person, even though they're in a destructive relationship, places a very high value on respecting parents. They're very respectful of their parents. They never talk bad about their parents. They'll do anything that their parents ask them to. It's just ingrained in them that having a high level of respect for your elders, especially your parents, is very important to them. Well, what you would want to show this person is that if they ever got married to this person that they're having a destructive relationship with, that if they continued to be in that relationship and they had children with that person, the children would ultimately see that person talking disrespectful to them, and it would cause them to have a lack of respect for that value system. So ultimately, because the kids would be exposed to the fighting and the arguing and the level of disrespect really for one another, they would grow up to have a lack of respect for their parents, which directly contradicts that person's value system. It directly contradicts something that they find very important. So again, don't judge people so easily, because in the process of judging them, you're not paying attention to them. And when you're not paying attention to them, you can't move on to step 2, which is trying to understand their map. And in trying to understand their map, identify key emotions, belief systems, and values. Once you've identified those things, show that person a better way that coincides with their values, emotions, and beliefs, or show them how continuing to engage in this destructive behavior somehow contradicts those things. And you'll have a much better chance of influencing and persuading them. If you enjoyed this video, like it, leave a comment, make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel.